Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings here on Now TV. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I really appreciate you being with me. It's really enjoyable to be able to come on and to be able to share my thoughts with you, to read your feedback. Even those who disagree, I mostly I mostly appreciate the fact that feedback is given. We can have good exchange. There are certainly some that are, out of line. They refuse to answer. They just basically get on my channel and preach and tell everybody how much of a false teacher I am without ever producing any proof. But, when I expose that error, then it helps other people to understand. So, anyway, I appreciate you being with me. Now, I want to continue our discussion of Daniel chapter 9 and the concept of the Kairos, the appointed time, the divinely appointed time for God's plan of salvation, his plan by which he was going to use Old Covenant Israel to bring salvation for the world. You see, that was always God's plan. God never, ever intended that the Old Covenant nation of Israel was the ultimate goal. No. Before Israel as a nation was ever brought into existence, God was promising that through Abraham and his seed, all nations of the earth would be blessed. Not just his lineage, but all nations. Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, does it say, "In you and your seed, I will bless all of your seed"? He did not say, "In you and your lineage, I'm going to bless all of your descendants." No, through you and your seed, and here's what's amazing. In the Hebrew, the word seed there, you and your seed, is in the singular. So, in reality, God wasn't promising in this text. I understand that there are some texts which indicate and which say that God, speaking to Israel, I will bless those that bless you, curse those that curse you. I understand that. But here in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3, the promise is that of the blessing of the nations, all nations of the earth, God was saying that blessing would come through the singular seed. That singular seed was not to be focused exclusively on Old Covenant Israel. And I know some people say, well, Jesus came and he said, I'm not sent except for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Well, that's right. His initial ministry was to Israel to fulfill God's promises to Israel so that all nations would then be blessed through the seed and through Israel. And that's something, unfortunately, an awful lot of people do not grasp. But you see, God said, even in Genesis chapter 28, 15 and following, in which God, through the angel, fought with Jacob all night long. And he called that place Bethel, house of God. But nonetheless, God made a promise to Jacob. He reminded him of the promise of Abraham. And then he said, I will not leave you nor forsake you. And he's not talking about Jacob personally. He's talking about his lineage. I will not leave you or forsake you until I have fulfilled all that I have promised. Okay, wait a minute. What that tells us is that once Yahweh had fulfilled all of his promises to Israel, that would be the time in which Old Covenant Israel was no longer the focus of God's scheme of redemption. But that's extremely powerful. And this segues beautifully into our study of the Kairos, because what is Daniel chapter 9 all about? Well, let's see. 70 weeks are determined upon you, upon your holy people, and upon the city. Here is God's focus on Israel, on Jerusalem, on the temple to do what? To make atonement. But you see, atonement was not exclusively for Israel. It was for Israel, to be sure, but it was to go from Israel to the nations. 70 weeks are determined to put away sin, not just Israel's sin, Israel-centric to be sure, but from Israel to the nations. And as we proceed in our study of the Kairos, the divinely appointed time, we will see this even more powerfully. So, in the meantime, let's get back to our focus of Daniel chapter 9, verse 24. 70 weeks are determined to finish the transgression. I've shared with you that scholars down through the centuries are in agreement. To finish the transgression meant to fill up the measure of sin. Now, whose sin is this? Is this a sin of the world? No. We have to understand that God was predicting the time in which Israel would fill up the measure of her sin, and God's justice would bring judgment on her, thus vindicating God's righteousness, vindicating God's justice, and then doing exactly what Genesis 28:15 and following suggested, that when God had fulfilled all of his promises to Old Covenant Israel, what would happen? He would set her aside. Now, that doesn't mean that he would abandon the righteous remnant. No, the righteous remnant was always the focus of God's promise of redemption. The righteous remnant with the Gentiles creating one new man. But in the meantime, guess what? God had to be righteous. God had to be just in judging the corporate body of Israel for their disobedience. You know, it's kind of like Isaiah 65, when God said, speaking of the corporate body of Israel, when I called, you did not answer, but you did that which is not right in my eyes. Well, what would be the result of that? Well, you know, Isaiah 65 tells us. Isaiah 66 tells us. When I called, you did not answer. Okay, what's the result of that? God bringing judgment on them and destroying them, destroying the people, the corporate body, the disobedient, and destroying the temple, the priesthood, the sacrificial system, and again, giving way to the new creation in which there is no chosen nationalistic nation, kingdom, that is any longer the focus of God's scheme of redemption. No, it's a new nation, bringing forth the fruit thereof, the fruit that the corporate body of Israel did not produce. Matthew chapter 21, 40 through 43. And in this new creation, there is no longer a physical temple. God and his Son and the believers are the temple. He dwells in us. We dwell in him. There's no longer any animal, physical, bloody sacrifices. Christ is our one time for all time perfect sacrifice to do away with. And let me make a comment here. Just this past week, I saw someone posting on Facebook that the doctrine of a replacement theology is an absolute abomination. Well, it depends on how you define replacement theology. I wrote a book some time ago. It's about that thick. It's one of the most extensive, one of the most in-depth examinations of the doctrine of the, quote, replacement theology that has been written. One nation, one kingdom, one people. In that book, I posed the following questions. For those who say, well, God never, ever, ever promised to replace Old Covenant Israel. Well, let's see. Did God promise to replace the physical temple with a spiritual temple? Unequivocally, yes. Did God promise to replace the Levitical, Zadokite, Aaronic priesthood with a spiritual priesthood of all believers? Undeniably, yes. Did God promise that he was going to create a new people comprised of both Jew and Gentile, the righteous remnant of Israel, along with the Gentiles, and destroy Old Covenant Israel that was rebellious? Well, yes, as a matter of fact, he did. Did he promise to replace the literal physical Jerusalem as the geocentric city of God? Well, yes. Again, undeniably he did. And do you know that most dispensationalists agree with that? At least in some form. So the point being that when Daniel 9 is predicting the time of the finishing and the completion of God's dealings with Old Covenant Israel, and it is predicting the destruction of the city and the people and the temple, and yet then promising the arrival of the world of everlasting righteousness, which is the new creation, as we shall see, God was implicitly saying the time is coming in which I'm going to replace the old covenant form. I'm going to replace the old covenant temple. I'm going to replace the old covenant altar. I'm going to replace the old covenant priesthood. I'm going to replace the old covenant sacrifices. And I'm going to bring into reality a totally new creation, a spiritual reality. Now, if you wish to call that replacement theology, I have no objections to that, but that is purely biblical. And if you want to read that, you need to go to my website, donkpreston.com and bibleprophecy.com. Go to my website and order the book, One Kingdom, One Nation, One People. This book has been called the most definitive refutation of the slanderous charge of replacement theology that's ever been written. I think you can see how there is a biblical doctrine of replacement theology that virtually everyone agrees with. It is not the replacement theology that dispensationalists point the finger at amillennialists and postmillennialists and preterists and say, see, you teach replacement theology. I teach what I call,
well, good morning, everyone.
Fulfillment.
Happy Monday morning to you.
Theology.
Welcome back to Morning
Which
Musings.
is in reality
my name is Don K. Preston.
the
I'm
focus
the president of Preterist Research
of Old
Institute
Testament promise.
of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And
It's
I
not a new
really
doctrine.
appreciate you being with me,
It
and I
begins
appreciate being with you.
in the Old Testament
I want to
and
jump
is
right
carried
back
through
into our discussion. Now,
all the way
remember,
through the New.
we've been spending a good
Now,
bit of time
back to our subject.
demonstrating
The finishing
that
of the
the coming of the
transgression.
Lord to bring in the
Listen,
new
folks,
creation of Matthew
you
chapter
can't
25,
miss the
31
point.
and following.
Okay,
Pardon me.
that
Is the coming
finishing
of the
the
Lord to bring in the new
transgression, filling
creation
up the measure of sin,
of Isaiah
is
chapter
absolutely
65.
related to the concept of
And
God setting aside the
That
corporate body of
correlation,
Israel,
ladies and gentlemen,
the nationalistic
becomes
theocracy,
definitive
to
proof.
create a new people.
Number one, the Olivet Discourse cannot
Israel
be
had
divided
to
into
fill
two
up the
different
measure of
subjects.
her sin
Number
for
two,
God to be righteous,
as a result of
holy,
that,
and just
it proves that
in
Matthew
punishing
chapter
them
25,
and
31
destroying
and following
them,
has nothing to do with
and
the so-called end of
taking the
time.
righteous remnant,
Point number
joining
three,
them with the
it proves
Gentiles,
beyond a
and
shadow of a
creating
doubt
this new
that
people
whatever our concept of Matthew
that
chapter
Paul would
25,
call
31 and following
in Galatians
might be,
chapter 6, verse
it
15,
has to be
the Israel of
focused on
God.
the fulfillment of God's Old
Okay.
Covenant promises made
So,
to Old Covenant Israel.
we had come to Matthew chapter 23. I've
Pardon
shared
me.
with you that here is
If
Daniel
it is true
being given the revelation that
that
70
the
weeks
coming of the Lord of
are
Isaiah
determined. Folks,
64
that's
to
the
66,
Kairos.
but
I've
Isaiah
shared with you
65 to bring in
how
the new
the word
creation
determined in the
is
Hebrew
the day of
is
the Lord to
kitak.
bring in the new creation
I
of
don't
Matthew
think I
chapter
pronounced
25.
that correctly, but anyway.
Then
And
since
it means
it's
cut
true
out.
that Isaiah chapter 65
In the stream
was a
of time,
promise made
God
to Old
said,
Covenant
from
Israel
here to
in
here.
the Old Testament,
This is the
obviously,
designated,
then it must be true
appointed,
that
divinely
Matthew 25,
appointed
31
time
and following
for the
is the
accomplishment of the
anticipation
scheme
of
of
the
redemption, to
fulfillment
put it in that
of
terminology.
God's Old Covenant promises
And
made to
so
Old
here
Covenant
is
Israel.
Yahweh saying,
Once again,
from the
that
time of the
proves
going
beyond a
forth of
shadow
the
of a
decree
doubt.
to rebuild and to
Matthew
restore
chapter
Jerusalem
25, 31 and
until
following,
the end of the 70
none
weeks,
of the Olivet
basically,
Discourse has
70
anything
weeks.
whatsoever to do with the end of the Christian age.
And
It's
I know
not
there's
about God's
all
promises
sorts
made to the church
of
divorced from
controversy
Israel.
about, okay, when did it begin? When did it
It's
end?
all
Well,
about the
guess what?
fulfillment of God's
It tells us
promises to
when it
Old
was going
Covenant
to
Israel.
begin, and it tells us
Now,
when
what
it was
was the
going to
purpose
end.
of that?
It was going to end, the full end.
God's
the
purposes
end thereof,
was to
the end
deal
of
with
what?
Israel,
And some people want to say,
to
well,
bring
the end
salvation
of
to
the end of the people in the
nations.
city. That's right. But the end
And
of
of
the people,
course, one of the
the
greatest
end of the
mistakes
city and the temple
that
is the end of the
exegetes
70th week.
when they come to Matthew chapter 25,
You can't
they
divorce
see it
those
as
two
the
concepts.
harvest of
So
the globe. They
that
see it as
70th
the
week, the 69th
harvest
and the 70th week
of the entire
brings us
history
right directly to the first
of
century.
humankind
Everyone
on
agrees
the
with that,
globe,
ladies and gentlemen.
and they see it as the
Everyone
end of
agrees
time.
with that. Well, except those who
Instead
say
of
that
seeing
Daniel
it
9
as the
was talking
time
about the time
of the
Antiochus
harvest
Epiphanes,
of
which
the
is
Old
not a
Covenant
tenable position.
age, and
But
the full
nonetheless,
ushering
we know
in of the eternal,
We know without a doubt
unending
the Jews of the first century believed they were living in the time
age of Jesus
of the
Christ.
fulfillment of Daniel 9.
And so
We know that the New
failure
Testament writers echo Daniel chapter 9.
to place Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following
Peter in 1
in
Peter
the proper
chapter 1
context and the proper
said the Old
prophetic,
Testament prophets
historical,
spoke of the sufferings of Christ
and
and the glory to
eschatological
follow.
context
Well, yes, I know
invariably
that Isaiah
leads
53 foretold
to
that.
a wrong interpretation.
But I also know that
of
Daniel
the
9,
Olivet
26
Discourse
and
as a
27,
whole,
or 24
and
through
specifically
27
Matthew chapter
foretold the
25,
sufferings of Christ. Verse
31
26.
and following.
Now then,
Messiah shall be
building
cut
upon
off.
that,
For the last couple of videos, I've been
but
sharing
Peter
with
also
you
spoke of the glory to follow.
what's the glory to follow.
Oh, I don't know. It might
I've been
be
focused on
the
the
world of
fact that, yes,
everlasting
indeed,
righteousness
Isaiah
of
65
verse
is the
24.
source for Matthew chapter 25, 31 and
So
following.
here's Peter
And with that
alluding
being
directly
true,
to Daniel chapter
okay,
9, and
there are
he
certain
said that
things
Jesus'
in
death is
Isaiah
directly
65
related to it.
that absolutely demand
So
that therefore Matthew 25,
we have
31
seen
and
from
following
Matthew
was fulfilled
21, Matthew
in
80,
22, and we touched
one
on
of the
Matthew
most beautiful
23 last
features
week
about
of
the filling up the measure of
Isaiah
sin in the
chapter 65
first century generation.
is the promise of the
Now,
Messianic
what would that
banquet.
mean, ladies and gentlemen?
This beautiful promise.
70 weeks
My
are
servant shall eat,
determined
you shall be hungry. My
to
servant
finish
shall
the
drink,
transgression.
you shall be thirsty.
70 weeks
My
are
servant shall
determined
sing for joy of
to
heart.
fill up the measure
You
of
shall
sin.
wail for sorrow of
Now,
heart.
I'm going to spend
You will
basically
leave your
the rest
name
of
as
my
a
time
curse
today
to my chosen.
addressing an argument that is
For the
made
Lord God
that
will slay
says
you.
the 70
Call his
weeks were
people by a new name.
completed.
It
Point
is
number
this
one,
new
either
people,
at the
ladies
time
and
of the
gentlemen,
death of Christ
comprised
on the
of
cross,
the
or
righteous
at
remnant
the time of
Old
the stoning
Covenant
of
Israel,
Stephen,
and
which
the
was
Gentiles.
just, a matter of weeks. That
Actually,
would
a
be
matter of
privileged
a couple
and
of
are
months
privileged to
after
eat
the
at
death
the
of Jesus.
Messianic banquet. I want to read to you.
This is such a beautiful concept.
Now, a translation, it is entitled The Kingdom New Testament by N.T. Wright, one of the foremost
Last
scholars
week,
in the world
we
today.
went to
I think
Isaiah
most
chapter 25.
would agree
I'm
with
going to
that.
try to keep
But
this
I want
video
to read
somewhat,
that, and I want you to pay very, very
somewhat
careful
brief.
attention.
I don't want to do 20 minutes.
To how N.T.
What
Wright
I want to
renders
do
the Greek
is take
of
a
the
look at
text in his
Isaiah
English
chapter
translation.
25 as it
And how it
correlates. And
takes
it
us-
does. It's obviously the
It
same
takes
thing.
us beyond the cross,
Isaiah chapter 25.
and it takes
Now
us
remember,
of
this is what is
necessity
known
beyond the
as the
stoning
little
of Stephen
apocalypse from Isaiah 24
for the
all the way
finishing of the
through
transgression.
chapter, I think, 28.
Well, I'm having to start the filming
In
over
that
as I
passage,
was in the midst
Isaiah
of speaking
24
there,
through 28.
had a massive
We
power
find the
spike.
repetition
My computer
of
went
the
off, it
prediction
stopped, and so
of the
I'm going
coming
to try to
destruction
pick up this.
of Jerusalem.
What I was just saying was that Matthew
Once
chapter
again,
23 takes us
not the end
in
of
regard to
time.
the finishing of transgression,
But at the time of
filling
the
up measure
destruction of
sin.
Jerusalem,
Pardon me.
for
It
instance,
takes
in
us
Isaiah chapter
beyond
24,
the last few
the
verses
cross, and
of
it takes
that
us
chapter
beyond the
what do
stoning
we
of
find?
Stephen.
Well, we find the judgment
Now,
of the
what that
wicked, the
means
judgment
is
being
you
shut
cannot
up in a
argue
prison for a long
that the 70
time.
weeks ended at the cross.
I personally have
You
a
cannot
tendency to
argue
correlate
that the finishing
to the millennium.
of transgression, the filling up of the
Be
measure
that
of
as it
sin,
may,
was finished by
following
the
hard upon that is the
suffering,
destruction
the
of the
martyrdom
temple and
of
the
Stephen.
city. And then
Just consider this very,
chapter
very quickly,
25,
okay?
6 and following.
Paul was very emphatic
Upon
that
this
he and
mountain.
the Greek of the text in Colossians 1, 24
What
and following
mountain, ladies and
is
gentlemen?
emphatic. Paul
I've
said,
shared with
I
you
now
in the
rejoice
past
in my sufferings for you, the Colossians.
The absolute
And
critical nature
It's in the emphatic
of
mode.
Zion.
I fill up that which is
the Old
lacking
Testament
in the afflictions of
messianic
Christ. So here's
prophecies.
Paul writing in the
Zion.
60s, 30 years after
messianic
the cross,
prophecy
30 years after the
was to be
stoning
the
of
locus
Stephen.
of the kingdom.
And Paul said that his personal sufferings
The
was
messianic
filling up
banquet,
the
Isaiah
measure
chapter
of sin,
2, verse
of
2
suffering.
and following. It shall come to pass in the
It
last
is therefore
days
completely
that the mountain of the
untenable.
Lord's house.
It's
Folks, that's
indefensible
Zion.
to say that the measure of
that's the
suffering,
promise of the
and
messianic
thus the
temple.
measure of sin on the part of Israel,
The mountain of the Lord's house shall be established
was finished
on
at
the
the
top of
cross,
the mountains and shall be exalted
or that
above
it was finished
the hills.
at the stoning
Many
of
people
Stephen.
will
Look,
come
in order
and
to
say,
take that
"Let us
position,
go
you've
up
got to show that
The
Stephen
mountain of the Lord
was
to
more
to Jerusalem,
important
to Zion.
than Paul. How would you
For the
do
word
that?
of the Lord will go forth
Well, there's no
from
way to do
Jerusalem
that, obviously.
to all the nations.
You just simply
So
cannot
Zion
do that.
is the locus of the kingdom.
I want to read for you now
Zion is the locus
a
of
modern translation. This is
salvation,
called
Isaiah
the
46
Kingdom
and
New
verse 30,
Testament,
verse 13.
by N.T. Wright,
Behold,
who is
I
one of the
put
foremost scholars
salvation
in the world today.
in Zion.
And as I was saying, when we look
And
at
I'm not going
Matthew
to spend
chapter
the time
23,
to elucidate
it takes
every
us beyond the
single
cross, and it
constituent
takes us
eschatological
beyond
concept
the stoning of
and
Stephen
soteriological
for the
concept
filling up of
that
the
is
measure
linked
of
with
sin.
Zion. But
The
look,
filling up of
it's
the measure of
just-
sin
it
is the
so
subject
rich. One of the
in the
richest,
verses that
one of
I'm
the
going
most
to read from
important
you. So
is
again,
resurrection.
I'm reading from N.T. Wright in his translation of the New
wedding.
Testament entitled The Kingdom New Testament,
Again,
Matthew chapter
the
23,
kingdom.
verses 27 and following. Woe
But
betide
resurrection.
you, scribes and Pharisees,
In
you
Isaiah,
hypocrites!
25.
You are like whitewashed graves,
Six and
which
following.
look very fine
I
on
want
the
you to
outside, but
notice
inside they're
how
full of
we
the
have
bones of the dead and uncleanness of
the
every kind.
messianic banquet
That's like you.
and
On
resurrection.
the outside, you appear to be virtuous and
bound up
law-abiding,
with
but
each other.
inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness.
In this
Woe
mountain,
betide
that's
you,
Zion.
scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites!
The Lord of
Now watch
hosts will
this
make
very
for all
carefully.
people
You build
a
the
feast
tombs of the
of
prophets
choice
and you
pieces.
decorate the memorials
A
of the
feast of
righteous, and you
wines
say,
on the
if
lees,
we had lived in the days
fat things
of
full
our
of marrow,
ancestors,
of
we wouldn't have gone
well-defined
along with them in killing the prophets.
wines on the lees.
So you testify against
And-
yourselves that you are the
See,
children of
here's
the
this
people who
coordinating
murdered
conjunction
the
that
prophets.
joins this
Well, then,
discussion
now
of
watch.
the messianic
Pay attention.
banquet on Zion.
Go ahead, complete
And he
the
will
work
destroy on
that your
this
ancestors
mountain.
began.
Now,
From
look, folks,
Jesus' perspective,
It's really, really, really common
the
for
work of filling up the measure
for
of
commentators
sin
to say,
by shedding innocent blood
yeah, we are
had not
privileged
been
now
completed
to sit
in
down
former
with
days.
the Lord in the kingdom.
Okay? That's
And we'll
point number
spend
one.
some time on Matthew
And
chapter
now watch
8,
what Jesus
verse 11.
Okay, I'm going to read this again.
Some former
well,
preterists
then go
claim
ahead and complete the
that
work
Abraham,
which your
Isaac, and
ancestors
Jacob
began. You
sat
snakes,
down at the
you
messianic
nest of
banquet
vipers, how can you
while they were still
escape
alive,
the
or
judgment
at
of
the very
Gehenna?
least after they died.
Because of all this, okay,
No,
the fathers
they
persecuting the martyrs,
didn't.
okay,
Unless they were
because of all
resurrected.
this, Jesus concluded,
And so
I
some of
am
these former
sending
preterists,
you
they say, well, you
prophets,
see, the
wise men
Messianic
and
banquet
scribes. Some of them
was established
you
long,
will
long
kill
ago.
and crucify. Some of them you will whip in
Abraham,
your
Isaac, and Jacob
synagogues.
are currently
You will
sitting
chase
at
them
the table.
from town to
But wait a
town.
minute. We're still waiting for
That is how
the resurrection.
Of the righteous blood that's
Do you
been
see
shed
the
on the earth
divorcing,
from the blood of
dichotomization
righteous
that these
Abel
individuals are engaging
to the blood
in?
of Zacharias son of Berechiah.
Oh,
You
Messianic
murdered him
banquet
between the
2,000 years
sanctuary
ago.
and the altar. Will come upon
Resurrection.
you. I'm telling you the
so
solemn
far,
truth. It will
2,000
all
years
come
later,
upon
and we're still waiting
this
on it.
generation. Now watch this.
So they insert
Jerusalem,
a 2,000-year gap,
killing the
into
prophets and stoning
end
those who are sent to you. How often
at the
I have
beginning
longed to gather up your children
of verse 8.
the way a hen gathers
and
up
by the way,
her brood under her wings, and
in
you didn't
so
want me
doing,
to. Now,
they divorce
see here,
this promise of the Messianic banquet,
your house
and this promise of the resurrection
has been abandoned
from the hope of Israel.
by God. It's a ruin.
As N.T. Wright said, in many, many ways, in different places,
You see, what N.T.
scriptures
Wright
teach us
recognized
that whatever it was that God promised that had planned for the nations,
the measure
he
of
would
sin
do it
would
in
not,
and
of suffering
through
and
Israel.
sin
Well,
would
what
not
that
be
means,
filled
ladies
up
and gentlemen,
at the time
guess
of the cross.
for
Did you
God's
notice?
promises for
He
the
didn't even
nations
mention his own death.
to be brought through Israel,
And it certainly does not imply
that means that God's
that
covenant
was not a
with
vital,
Israel
integral, foundational aspect of the filling up of the
had to
measure of
remain
sin. I'm
valid.
not suggesting that. I'm not hinting at it in
because
any way,
it was
shape,
God's
form, or fashion.
covenant with Israel.
I'm simply saying that Jesus is pointing out that the filling up of the measure of sin would not be done
the
at the
Abrahamic
cross,
promise carried through Torah.
even though he well understood it was foundational to that.
You cannot separate,
No,
ladies and gentlemen,
Jesus looked beyond the cross
the
and he said,
blessings that God
I
had planned
am going to send to you
for the nations
prophets, wise men, scribes.
Israel.
And yet we're supposed to
And you
believe that
cannot separate Israel
in the death of one,
from God's covenant with her.
in the death of
And to
one
say,
servant
oh,
of
well,
Jesus,
God removed
Stephen,
God's, or, excuse
the
me,
measure of sin was completely
he
filled
removed
up.
his covenant with Israel.
Not what Jesus
oh,
said.
But wait, we're still waiting for God
I'm
to
going to
bless
send
the
you
nations
prophets,
through
wise
Israel.
men, and scribes.
What?
And in Luke chapter
You see,
11,
it makes no sense whatsoever.
Jesus expands
So,
that and says, I'm going to send to
This
you
brings us up to
my
the point
apostles.
of
Well,
realizing
Stephen was
that
not
whatever
an
Isaiah
apostle
chapter 25,
like the 12.
in regard to the Messianic banquet, in regard
And
to
yet
the resurrection,
Jesus said,
no matter what
you're
we
going to
might
kill
perceive
them,
it to
i.e.
be,
the apostles.
it had to be fulfilled.
And in doing
while
so, you're going to
Israel
fill up the
remained
measure of
God's
your sin.
covenant people,
So
which
Jesus,
means that
once
Matthew
again,
chapter
takes the
25,
filling
31
up
and following
of
would
the
only be
measure of
fulfilled
sin and suffering
when
as a
Israel
corollary.
remained as God's covenant
And
people.
he extends
you see
it
the problems
beyond the cross.
of placing Matthew 25, 31 and
Folks,
following
that means
at the so-called end of the endless
finishing up
Christian
of
age.
transgression
It
was not
just
done at the cross
doesn't
or at the stoning
work.
of Stephen. And I'm completely
And
out
I
of
discuss
time.
all of this and
So
more
I'll see you next week.
in this month's incredibly good two-book offer. The resurrection of Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, fulfilled our future, and we shall meet him in the air, the wedding of the King of Kings. Both of these books, listen, if you purchase both of these books separately and you paid separate shipping, it costs you almost $58. All right? During the month of May 2023, U.S. orders only, total delivered price $39.95. That's going to save you a real healthy chunk of money. Go to my website, donkpreston.com or BibleProphecy.com. There's a wonderful tab right up at the very top. Just click the link, place your order, and you'll be glad you did. Okay, more on the Messianic banquet on the flip side.